Glad you're here. I want to welcome those who are watching online. I want to thank the folks up in the premium seating there in the balcony. Good to see you guys. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to go to Hebrews chapter 12. While you're turning there, I want to tell you about next weekend. Dave will tell you a little more about it later, but my favorite preacher is going to be here. Bob Russell from Louisville, Kentucky, preached for 40 years at Southeast Christian. Just to put this in perspective, when he started, they ran about 100, and when he retired, they averaged over 20,000 every weekend. So great opportunity for us to have him here. He's been here before, looking forward to coming back, but I hope you can be here. Invite some people to come with you. You know, we put in a big effort for Back to Church Sunday. It'd be great to put in that same kind of effort this week, so hope you can help us out. I want to start today by showing you a picture. This is a guy you won't recognize, but you may know his story. His name is Sin Dong Haik, or something like that. You can look it up later. He was born in November of 1982 in a North Korean prison camp. Now, you may not know much about North Korea, but one thing we all know is that the world that he was born into is much different than the world that you and I live in. From the very earliest days of life, if you're in North Korea, you're fed a steady diet of propaganda that, you know, North Korea is the greatest place on earth and everywhere else is horrible. Most international groups who watch this sort of thing agree that the camp that he was born into, which is known as Camp 14, is the worst prison camp on earth. It's very much a modern day concentration camp. And not only was Sin Dong Haik born there, both his mom and his dad were born there. And the reason being, years earlier, he had an uncle who had defected, had left North Korea, and was smuggled into South Korea. And even today in North Korea, they practice what's known as the 3 degrees of punishment. Here's what that means. If somebody in your family commits a crime against the state, and they not only punish that person, but they punish the next 3 generations of that person's family. So here's a guy that's completely innocent. His mom and dad are completely innocent, and he's born into this terrible prison camp. For the first 23 years of his life, all of his life came down to one word, and that was the word obey. The guards would come in, wake him up, tell him what to do. They would do it. Mealtime would come around, and all they were ever fed, 3 meals a day, was corn gruel and cabbage. They tell you to eat it, that's what you eat. In his world, there were 2 types of people. There were prisoners and there were guards. And you were born one or the other, and that's what you remained for the rest of your life. In a 2015 interview with 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper, he was asked if when he was growing up, if he ever thought of trying to escape that prison camp. Here's what he said. He said, "Never. What I thought was that the world outside the camp would be similar to that world inside the camp." So in his mind, he was a prisoner. That was all he was ever going to be. For 23 years, that was his life. You got up, you worked, you went to bed tired and hungry, you got up the next morning, you were tired and hungry, and that was his life. The world changed for him, though, when one day a new prisoner was brought to the camp, a guy named Park. And right from the moment he arrived, the other prisoners could tell there was something different about Park. And what was different about him is that rather than living his life inside the confines of the prison, he had actually experienced the outside world. And he began to tell the other prisoners what it was really like to travel. He'd been to China. He'd been to South Korea. He told them what it was like to eat in a restaurant, something that they could never have imagined. And immediately, as he started telling these stories, it started opening up a whole new world of possibilities to the people who were inside the camp. There was one thing in particular, though, that he talked about that really captured the imagination of Sin Dong Haik. And what it was, he talked about what it was like to eat broiled chicken. Now, in his world, Sin Dong Haik had never tasted chicken. But as he heard this other guy talk about what it was like to eat chicken and talk about it as if it was an everyday occurrence, it began to really spark his interest. It began to capture his imagination. He said later that when he went to bed at night, he dreamed of what it would be like to eat broiled chicken. When he woke up in the morning, the first thing he'd think about was broiled chicken, and his mouth would water. pretty soon it became such a strong obsession with him that he and Park decided they were going to try to escape the prison camp. Nobody in history had ever escaped Camp 14, but they thought they could do it. So in January of 2005, the night of their attempted escape rolled around, and they had their plan. They took off running towards the fence that formed the outer barrier of the camp, and something happened. Park slipped and fell in the ice and the snow, whatever happened, and he fell into the fence. The problem was the fence was highly electrified. It sent a huge amount of voltage through his body, immediately stopping his heart. And in that moment, Sing Dong Haik had a decision to make. Is he going to go back, try to get back in his dorm, or is he going to try to complete their mission of escaping the prison? And what he did next was something nobody had ever thought about. He used the body of his friend Park as a bridge. He set his body up against the fence, climbed over his body, jumped over the top, and escaped Camp 14. He became the first person and only person in history to ever escape Camp 14. Looking back, he said it was that image of broiled chicken that drove him forward. Here's what Anderson Cooper said. He said, "I've heard people define freedom in many ways. I've never heard anyone define it as a piece of broiled chicken. But if you're born into a prison camp, little things become big things." Within a few weeks after escaping, he found his way to China. Within a year, he defected to South Korea, where he was granted asylum. It's a really incredible story. There's a book titled Escape from Camp 14 if you're interested in knowing more. But for the past several weeks, we've been talking about this process of leaving behind your old life, breaking free from your old life, breaking the chains of regret that want to hold you back. And as I was reading that story this week, it reminded me that's a pretty good illustration of the life that many of us experience. You wake up one day and you realize you're a prisoner. Now, you may not be in a physical prison, but you're in a spiritual prison. For a lot of people, it's the only life they've ever known. It's a life marked by sin and regret and bad choices. But then one day Jesus shows up and he starts talking about a totally different way of life, a totally different world that you can experience. The problem is it's a life that's so foreign to you, you're not sure it makes sense. It's a life defined by freedom and grace and mercy and fresh starts. And a lot of people, we would give anything if we could experience that world. We would give anything if we could move from the world we're in to the world that Jesus talks about. The problem is every time we try to get there, we fail. We can't seem to fix our own problem, no matter what we do, no matter what we try. We can't unchain ourselves from the past. So Jesus comes in and he does what only he can do, and by going to the cross, he becomes the bridge that we cross over to move from the old life to the new life. Now here's my question. What if, after experiencing just a taste of freedom, Sing Dong Haik had decided that he was going to go back to the prison camp? I mean, what if he just got out in the world and he'd say, this is really not all it's cracked up to be. This is harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm just going to go back to what I grew up in. Now, on the surface of it, that seems like a ridiculous question, but the truth is, that's what a lot of people do when it comes to their spiritual life. They have some sort of taste of freedom. There comes this moment of recognition where they realize, hey, I need to change. There's some things that need to be different. They break the chains that are weighing them down. They leave, their baggage behind. But then for some reason or another, at some point, they wind up returning to where they'd been. Some of you have experienced that. You make some sort of spiritual decision, but then you sort of get distracted, and before you know it, you start drinking again. Or you start gambling again. Or the pressure mounts and you're working more and more hours and you're paying less and less attention to your family. And before you know it, you can wind up right back where you started. Happens to a lot of people. The Apostle Paul warned the early Christians about this in Galatians 5. I want you to look at this with me on the screen. Here's what Paul said. He said, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." That's the first part. "Stand firm then," and check this out, "do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Whatever you do, don't go back to where you were. Don't go back to the prison that you just escaped in. And remember, he's writing this to Christians. I mean, these are people just like us. They'd made some progress. They'd moved forward, but then it got a little bit harder. It wasn't all that they thought it would be, and now they're tempted to go right back to where they started from. That's an experience most of us can probably identify with. I want to show you a graph that may help explain this. This is what's called the J curve. You may have seen this before. If you invest a lot of money, you'll sometimes see this. Researchers use it to explain what happens when we learn new skills and how it matches our performance. So, for example, as human beings, whenever we learn a new skill or we learn to do something the right way, sometimes your performance actually gets worse before it gets better. Let me give you an example. If you grew up, playing a guitar or learning to play an instrument of some sort, and then later on in life you start to take lessons and somebody shows you, the right way, or this is the way it's supposed to sound, you start doing it the right way, the odds are your performance is going to get worse before it gets better. If you grew up playing sports, if you played basketball, for example, you shot out in your driveway, and then you go to a coach, and there's a coach that shows you the right way to hold the ball and the right way to shoot the ball. It's going to take you a while before you become comfortable. The odds are you're going to get worse. You're going to miss more shots before you start making shots. Don't raise your hand on this. Anybody ever started a diet or a workout program? Then if you have, things get worse before they get better. You know what I mean? You feel bad. And the lesson of the J curve is this. Things initially get worse before they eventually get better. Things initially get worse before they eventually get better. Jamie, if you'll go back to the graph for just a minute, I want to show you something. You see the little dip there right at the beginning? That's called the valley of death. And that's where a lot of people quit. You start your diet program, you don't feel so good, you're not losing weight, you quit. You're missing more shots than you're making, you quit. You go back to the old way of life. There's always this tendency. That's where people turn back. That's where most projects fail. And the reason that's true is because all of us have this tendency, I'll admit to it, I'm not the only one, that when things get a little bit stressful, when things get a little bit hard, we tend to go back to what's comfortable. We may know that it's not right. We may know that it's not the best thing for us, but we go back to what's comfortable because it's what we're most familiar with. And things initially get worse, and we stop, and that way things never get better. You go back to the disciples. You read about these guys that followed Jesus, the earliest followers of Jesus. They left behind their homes, they left behind their families, and they signed up to follow Jesus. And I'm sure they had, great visions of what life was going to be like, but then they discovered that instead of getting better, things initially got worse. Life got worse. Life got harder. And you see them making the same dumb mistakes that we make. They argue over silly stuff. They say the wrong things at the wrong times. They get distracted. They get discouraged. They make bad decisions. I mean, they were just like us. They had made this decision that they were going to follow Jesus. But then when things got worse, they weren't sure what to do. But here's what they did do. Or at least 11 of the 12 did do. They didn't turn back. They did not quit. Even though it was not what they expected, even it probably wasn't what they signed up for, they refused to turn back. And for them, you read their story, things initially got worse, but they eventually got better. The same thing is likely to happen when you start the process of unloading some of your baggage. You start pulling things out of the suitcase, makes you have conversations that maybe don't go so well, makes you think about things that you'd rather not think about. And it's easy when you get in that initial dip, when things aren't going as well as you thought they would, to go back to that old life, to drift backwards. That's why so many people never make it. That's why so many people never even try it. It gets us a little bit difficult, and they go back to what's comfortable. If you have your Bible open to Hebrews 12, I want us to look at just three verses that can help us avoid that can help us avoid going backwards and help us move forward and keep putting one foot in front of another. Let me set this up for you. Hebrews is the only book in the New Testament that's anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, but we do know the situation that prompted it. It's a letter written to some Jewish Christians who were facing unimaginable persecution. So here are these people, they've signed up to follow Jesus, and they were convinced that he was going to lead them to the promised land. It's a new life. It's all going to be great. And initially, things get a lot worse. They lose their jobs. They lose their homes. Many of them lost their lives. Now the ones that are remaining are running for their life. And keep in mind, here these people, they're just like us. They had big dreams, and things are not as easy as they thought they were going to be. So the writer of Hebrews writes this letter, and over again he says one thing: don't go back. Don't turn back. Just keep going. As hard as it is, no matter how many obstacles you face, you just keep moving forward. And you get to Hebrews 12, and he explains what it looks like to actually live this kind of life. So I want you to look at this with me, Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Now I want you to look at verse 1. It starts with this word, therefore. It's a connecting word that points you back to what the writer has already said. So if you're familiar with Hebrews, you get to Hebrews chapter 11, the previous chapter, it's what we call the Faith Hall of Fame. The writer goes through, he lists all these Old Testament characters who we consider to be the heroes of the faith. They're kind of the Hall of Famers, if you will, the model we're supposed to follow. But if you go back and you actually read the stories of the people that are listed there, you realize these are not like stained glass window kind of people. I mean, these people had some pretty ugly stuff in their backgrounds. So, for example, Hebrews 11, verse 7, the writer mentions Noah. Now, most of the time we think about Noah, he built the ark and saved humanity from the flood. But did you know that Noah, at one point in his life, had a pretty serious drinking problem? Read about that in Genesis chapter 9. Then there's Abraham. We think about Abraham, he's the father of many sons and all that. But there was a point in his life that Abraham lied to a king and told the king that his wife was actually his sister. And you can imagine the rest of that story. Then there's Jacob. The first time we're introduced to Jacob, he lies to his father, he tricks his father, and he tricks his brother out of his birthright. Verse 23, he mentions Moses. Moses, we talked about him last week, murdered an Egyptian. Then there's Rahab, the prostitute. And then there's Samson. You know his story, got so distracted by Delilah that he lost his eyesight and eventually lost his life. And the point is, you go through every single one of those people had some unbelievable skeletons in the closet. I mean, they had more than enough in their background to derail anything that God wanted to do through them. But then you get to the end of Hebrews 11. I want you to listen to how the writer describes these same people. Here's what he says. He says, the world was not worthy of them. And you hear that and you think, wait a minute, are we talking about the same group of people? The world was not worthy of them. The guy who got drunk and laid naked in front of his kids, the prostitute, the guy that got distracted, got his eyes poked out, the guy that lied to the king, the guy that murdered the other guy. Those are the people that the world was not worthy of. You got to be kidding. And then you keep reading and it's like, yeah, those are the people. Those are the people. And the question is, how did they get from where they started to where they finished up? How did they get past all the craziness in their past to making it to the Hall of Fame? 3 things, Hebrews 12, you see them. Here's the first one. If you want to experience this freedom, you want to avoid turning back, you have to learn to listen to the right voices. That's how you make progress. If you ever played sports growing up, then you know the value of having a crowd of people cheer you on. As a referee, I can also tell you there's a lot of value in having everybody boo you at the same time, too. It's kind of eye-opening experience. If you watched the Kentucky's game last week against Mississippi State, and even more so last night against South Carolina, one of the things that coaches and players talk about is how much energy, the crowds brought to the team. And if you played sports, when everybody's cheering for you, it sort of, gives you new energy, helps you take your game to the next level. Hebrews 12, the writer tells us that all of us as followers of Jesus, we have a huge crowd of people that are cheering us on. In verse 1, they're called this great cloud of witnesses. And I don't know what comes to your mind when you read that, but for me, I always imagine it, kind of like this. You get up and you go somewhere and you make a decision. Got this weird confrontation, and you make this decision that you're going to tell the truth rather than, telling a lie to protect yourself. And in the background, you can hear people cheering for you. You can hear the Apostle Paul and Peter and James and John, they're cheering you on. You get up to go to work one day, and for that one day you decide, I'm going to pour my whole heart and soul into this. I'm going to, work as hard as I can, I'm not going to slack off. And in that moment you can hear the roar of the crowd. Or maybe you're in a tough conversation and something comes up and that you've got to take a stand for truth that's not going to make you popular, but you do it anyway. And you can hear Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and they're cheering for you. In my mind, it's not just people from the Bible either. Most of you growing up, you had people that cheered for you when you did something good. I was thinking about this. My grandpa was my hero. When I first started in ministry, I'd be preaching somewhere, and every once in a while, not often, but every once in a while he would come, and if I did an okay job, he'd always do the same thing. He'd shake my hand, he'd say, "Good job, son." And every once in a while, if I get down, I can kind of hear that. And you've probably got people, just because they're not here anymore don't mean they're not cheering for you. And you have to remember that. The other thing about this is I think this extends not only to people who have passed on, but to people who are still alive. I mean, there are people that you surround yourself with right now that are very much a part of this cloud of witnesses. And one of the things through Hebrews, the writer keeps saying the Christian life is kind of like a race. You know, you're running this race. You're running towards the finish line. And the thing I was reading this week, runners, when they're preparing for competition, you know what they don't do? They don't run alone. Olympic runners never run alone. They always train with somebody else. Because they know they need somebody to encourage them, somebody to push them, somebody to challenge them, somebody that can bring the best out in them. And that's the way it's supposed to work. Same principle applies to your spiritual life. We all need people who can push us and challenge us and encourage us. But you have to be careful who you choose to listen to. If you're going to make it long term, you've got to learn to listen to the right voices. For some of you here today, the reason you struggle so much, the reason you've not made much progress is because you don't have a group. You're not in a connect group. You're not in a core group. There's nobody encouraging you. You're just sort of floating along, and you need somebody that can help you. Here's a second thing. If you want to experience this life Jesus offers, you have to continually unload the weights that are holding you back. 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out. A couple weeks ago, I shared with you this quote from the French aviator, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Here's what he said. He who would travel happily must travel light. What do you mean by that? You go through life, if you've got your suitcase too heavy, if it's loaded down with too much junk and regret and baggage, you try dragging that along with you, it's not going to be a very fun journey. It's going to weigh you down. And it's really hard sometimes to move on from that, but some of you have done it. You look back and you think, man, I wish I'd have unloaded that stuff years ago because life is a lot better without it. But there's something I've noticed about myself, and maybe this is true of you. Every once in a while, you unload your baggage. You get rid of all this stuff, you put it behind you, and then for whatever reason, you get distracted, you get tired, you get frustrated, and you pick it back up. Anybody else ever done that? My friend John Hampton calls these regret relapses. You go back to something that you know is not where you want to be. It's like going back to prison. But the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand if we're going to continue to move forward, you don't go back and pick that stuff back up again. You continually unload that stuff. In verse 1, he says there's two basic forms of these happen. Number one is distractions. Some of us get weighed down by distractions. There's a lot of things in your life that can distract you from the things that God is calling you to. Could be even good things. For some people, it's their career. They're so worried about their job. They're so focused on trying to do a good job that it pulls them away from something good, pulls them away from what's best. In our culture, for a lot of people, it's sports. I've been guilty of that. Some people, they'll spend hours every week going to practice, this game, but they can't seem to find, 45 minutes in a whole week to connect with Jesus. For some people, it's a hobby. For some people, it's too much time in front of the TV or the iPad. For some of us, the best thing you could do today be to go home, look at your schedule for the next couple of weeks, and just ask yourself, if I know my time is limited, if I know time's running out and the race is drawing to a close, is this the best use of my time? Is what I'm doing right now going to take me where I want to go? And for a lot of us, the answer would be no. There's another type of weight, though, and this one's a little bit harder to unload. That's sin. One of the things that's always been true is that it's hard to run a race when your feet are tangled up. And the writer of Hebrews makes it clear that's what sin does. It tangles us up, makes it hard to move forward. Think about it. You've never seen a runner step up to the starting line with shackles around his feet because he wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And that's what a lot of people do when it comes to their spiritual life. They're trying to move forward, but they're being held back by a lot of junk in their life. It just doesn't need to be there. So what's he talking about? What's the sin that tangles us up? Well, it's probably different for everybody, but my suspicion is you know what it is for you. For some people it's pride, other people it's greed, some people it's lust, some people it's gluttony. I mean, it could be anything that trips you up, but you probably know what it is. The question then is, how do you deal with it? That's the third thing. You want to make it to where God's calling you to go, you learn to fix your eyes on Jesus. Perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. I want you to listen really close for a minute. If you don't hear anything we've said the last few weeks, this is the most important. The way that you defeat sin in your life, the way that you unload some of this stuff, is not by trying harder. It's not by coming up with a whole bunch of religious stuff that you make sure you do so that you're doing more good stuff than bad stuff. It never works. The way you defeat sin is by keeping your eyes fixed on the one who defeated sin for you. That's the only way you can make it. The good news of the Bible is that you're not condemned to spend your life running away from sin. Your job is to run as fast as you can towards Jesus. And there's a huge difference. That's why in verse 2, the writer reminds us that the battle that a lot of us are fighting on a daily basis has already been won. I mean, when Jesus went to the cross and embraced the shame of the cross, he took upon himself the punishment that we deserve. He's already won the battle. Therefore, you and I are not condemned to go through life carrying around all this baggage. He's already taken care of it. Our job is to let go of it and to run towards him, and he takes care of all the other issues. But here's the problem. Sometimes we forget that. I forget that. You forget that. We make a good start. We make a decision. We're going to move forward. Things are going to be different. But then you know what happens. Life gets busy. It gets hectic. You're tired. You're frustrated. And pretty soon, without even realizing it, you get distracted. And then you start to drift. And we lose sight of what's most important. We lose sight of Jesus. And here's what you have to understand. This is not easy. But it's impossible if you're trying to run towards Jesus while you're looking somewhere else. You'll never make it. The only way to make it is to look towards Jesus, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, and then run towards Jesus. But it's not going to be easy. Here's what you have to understand. The road from the old life to the new life is not smooth. I mean, it's not a flat surface. It's not like driving down the interstate. I mean, there's a lot of hills. There's a lot of bumps. There's some mountains that you have to go through. There's some rough patches of road that you have to navigate. And sometimes it's going to get really messy. And sometimes things are even going to get worse before they get better. But the key is, if you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, if you keep putting one foot in front of the other, eventually things do get better if you keep going. For some of us here this morning, the reason we're having such a hard time making it towards Jesus is because we're looking a different direction. Our eyes are focused on other things. For some people, it's their career. For some people, it's their bank account. For a lot of people in our culture, it's the political landscape, and we watch the news and we get all worked up about what's happening or what's not happening, what we think should happen, and we take our eyes off of Jesus and we get all weirded out. For some people, it's social media. They're obsessed with what's happening in somebody else's life, somebody else's family, and they're neglecting what's happening in their own life. And they take their eyes off of Jesus and they put it on something else. And do you know what happens whenever you take your eyes off Jesus for very long? The writer tells us in verse 3, you grow weary and you lose heart. You grow weary and you lose heart. You begin to convince yourself that your old life wasn't that bad, or maybe you're like Sin Dong Park, you convince yourself that the new life's not going to be all that different from the old life, and you're just content with what's comfortable and what's routine. But there is a better option. Instead of turning back, you can choose to hang in there. Might not be easy, might not always be the path of least resistance, but the promise is if you hang in there long enough, things do get better. Galatians 6, here's what Paul says. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. Some of you heard me say this before. You look around this building, 100 years old now, there's only one verse of Scripture anywhere in these windows, and it's this verse. It's right behind this organ. You think 100 years ago, 1915, why would they put that? Why would they put that one verse? I mean, why, of all the verses in the Bible, why would you choose that one? Because they were on to something. They knew there'd be times when you feel like quitting. But the promise is, if you hang in there, yeah, things may initially get worse, but they'll eventually get better. After escaping that North Korean prison camp at the age of 23, it took Sin Dong Haik several years to sort of get his act together and find his foot. And you can imagine you've been raised in a prison. You know, they make every decision for you. Now you're out in the world on your own for the first time. You got to figure out jobs and relationships and forming friendships and paying your bills. And for him, his initial life was not all that much better. I mean, he was on the run from the North Koreans. They were after him. He had nowhere to go, no way to make ends meet. It took him years to sort of figure it out. But eventually his life slowly started to improve. He made some friends. He started a career. He even met a young lady and married her and wound up having a son. I got a picture I want to show you. After a few years of sort of getting his life together, there started to be this growing awareness in his life that there were still people that he knew. There were still hundreds of people that were living in that same camp that he had escaped from. So he decided to do something. He didn't know what to do, but he decided he would start to tell the story of what was really going on behind the curtain in North Korea. Get cut past all the propaganda. Here's what it's really like. So he's formed this advocacy group, and he started traveling all over the world telling his story. And as a part of his presentation, every time he does two things. Number one, he tells what it was like growing up, and then towards the end there's this dramatic moment where he rolls his pant legs up, and he turns around and he shows the people the deep scars in the back of his legs where he was beat by the North Korean prison guards. And then he'll raise his hand and he'll show them where he had a finger removed, cut off by a guard who got mad when he didn't respond to his orders quick enough. And it's kind of the way to say, hey, you've heard all this. Let me show you the results of what happens when you grow up in a North Korean prison camp. And what he's doing is he's using his scars to tell his story, to point people to a better way of life. Now, we're going to close this series in just a moment. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff. Maybe you're ready for me to move on to something else because you're tired of thinking about it. There's three groups of people here right now. For some of you, this has not been pleasant. You've thought about some things. You've talked about some things that you just as soon wish would go away. You didn't have to deal with them. And if that's you, I understand that. And my hope is that you'll at least use what you've heard over the last few weeks to begin the process of healing. Maybe it won't be quick. Maybe it won't be easy. Maybe things will initially get worse, but just begin the process. Others of you here, and you're in the process, but things have not been easy. It's not gone as well as you hoped. It's not been as easy as you hoped. And my encouragement to you is exactly what the letter to Hebrews says. Just don't turn back. I know it's hard. I know it's not always pleasant. I know it's probably not what you envisioned it would be. It may not be what you thought you signed up for. But I'm telling you, if you stay in there long enough, it does get better. The new life is much better than the old life if you hang in there over the long haul. Others of you here, and you've been faithful. I mean, you've dealt with your stuff, long ago. You had some pretty ugly stuff, some pretty bad skeletons, and you've dealt with it. Maybe over the years you've continued to deal with it. And what you need to do is just remind yourself what it was like to be there, and then use your scars to tell your story to some other people. I'm telling you, you look around our community, I talk to people every week, and some of you do too, and they're hopeless. They're not sure what to do. They're not sure if there's anything better for them. They're not sure that life's ever going to get any better. And what they need is for somebody like you, somebody like me, who's been through some of that stuff, to put your arm around them and say, hey, I know it's hard. I know it's probably worse than you thought it was going to be, but there is something better, and I'm going to help you get there. And if you'll do that, you can change somebody's life in ways that you cannot imagine. But you have to do it. I want you to stand. We're going to sing just a brief invitation. If you're here and you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, David and I will be here. We'll pray with you. We're not going to embarrass you. You don't have to say anything. We'll just help you start navigating this process. Others of you may be here and you say, hey, I want to make a decision to follow Christ. I want to be baptized into Christ. We can do that. If you want to join the team here at FCC, we'd love to have you.